Well, good morning, everyone. It is just a few minutes after 11, and while we still have a few people rolling in, I figure let's go ahead and get started. I've got some intro stuff to do before we get to the main attraction. So let's see. All right, we're on the right side. So welcome to the latest of DHCD's Creating Community Vitality series focused on attractions and assets, interweaving urban design and development strategy with hyper-local get-it-done creativity. This is going to be a good one. I am Kyle Meyer with DHCD's Community Revitalization Office, and I'll be your moderator today. So, as always, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. To reduce background noise and distraction, please mute yourself. At the bottom of your browser window, look for the little microphone. We are recording the webinar, and shortly after the recording and presentation, the recording and presentation handout will be posted on virginiamainstreet.com. There will be a Q&A opportunity at the end, so please use the chat feature to ask questions. Nevertheless, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A at any point. Find that chat feature in the upper right-hand corner of your browser. Alternatively, print and note your questions in the series workbook, and you can download that from virginiamainstreet.com in the series tab. So speaking of chat, let's give a shout out to the communities that are participating today. So please let us know where you all are from or joining us from in chat. Oh, I love it. Stanton, good to see you. Pam in Withville, all the way out in Southwest, and Buena Vista in the Valley, and Danville, Henrico just north of Richmond, Strasburg and Ashland, Martinsville in Southern Virginia, Onancock on the Eastern Shore, Lexington in the Valley, Blackstone in Southern Virginia, in Martinsville, Cincinnati, yes. Right on. Glad to have you here. In Warrenton. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It looks like we have a really nice spread of the Commonwealth and a few Ohioans. So welcome. All right. So thanks for joining us. This monthly series intent is to provide inspiration, ideas, and resources to help position your community for success in a post-COVID world. By ensuring local amenities, infrastructure, and social offerings are in place to retain and attract an increasingly mobile workforce. We recognize the market is changing and there are new opportunities ahead. The series is organized around three key themes: identity, recognizing your community's core strengths around place, people, and the leadership pipeline; ecosystems, exploring the systems that support successful business startup, tourism, housing, and worldwide connectivity; and community, strengthening public spaces that encourage interaction, inviting cultural events that celebrate local foods and history, and involving everyone to affect change. Today is the first of 5 webinars within the ecosystems theme. The monthly topics are spread throughout the year and are reinforced through DHCD's Partners for Better Communities podcast and Virginia Main Street blog posts. Go to virginiamainstreet.com to learn about the upcoming webinars and podcasts. In June, we focus on housing with contributing members of Proud Places, and we'll talk about bringing new life to old buildings. All right, so let's get to the main attraction. In today's webinar, you will learn about how to create demand by uncovering your community assets, sparking momentum, and crafting plans that build on what you have. Speaking of plans, we notified by mail yesterday, email yesterday, the first 20 registrants for this webinar that will soon receive the Neighborhood Playbook by Yard & Company. It's a field guide that facilitates the activation of spaces within the goal of influencing physical and economic growth in neighborhoods. So thank you everyone for jumping on the opportunity to participate today. We'll mail those books out very soon. So what is this Yard & Company? Well, our speakers today are Kevin Wright and Joe Nickell of Yard & Company, an urban growth firm that uses urban design and development strategy to help people uncover what is possible for their places through market making, storytelling, and problem solving. They help organizations build amazing places. Kevin is Principal and Director of Operations and Strategy, a leader in community development, economic real estate development, and placemaking. One of his recent career highlights is leading community engagement during COVID to find ways to continue to get the work done. Considering how his perspective of the world changed over time, when starting his career in urban planning, he wanted outcomes right away. But after having kids, and we can all identify with that, he realized it's okay to make incremental changes over time. On days off, he loves to run, trail run specifically in his Cincinnati neighborhood. Joe is Principal and Director of Design and Development. When asked about his career highlight, he said in all of his professional accomplishments, completing projects in over 7 countries and nearly half of the United States, those milestones are all very personally satisfying, but nothing competes with walking around a place you helped create and seeing smiles in the faces of complete strangers, spending time among one another by their own choosing. That's a wonderful feeling, and you all probably can all identify with that as well. Considering how his perspective of the world changed over time, he says, as he gets older and bigger, he increasingly appreciates the power of littler and littler things. On his days off, he likes to do anything outdoors without a screen with his wife and 3 boys. Welcome, Kevin and Joe. Let me stop sharing and I'll hand it over to you. And while I do that, tell me the story of Yard and Company.
All right, well, hello everybody. I'm gonna do this magic dance where I share my screen while beginning to talk. Sharing is caring. So Yard and Company, first off, thank you for having us today, and good morning. It still is morning. We're happy to be here, and we're going to get through a presentation and then hopefully have a really robust conversation about some of the things that we bring up on these slides today. Yard and Company is a boutique urban growth firm based out of Cincinnati. We are a team of designers and planners who work really across the country on everything from small-scale pop-up events to large-scale downtown master and countywide master plans. We have 3 divisions of our company: design, experience, and development. And I think you'll see as we walk you through these slides that the relationship between those three divisions and how they all work together to build better places. I'll talk about the Neighborhood Playbook in just a moment, but that is what led to the beginning of Yard and Company. You got a little bit of our bios, but we're unique in the sense that my background is originally in journalism and then in community development. I ran a community development corporation revitalizing a main street in Cincinnati for about 7 years, and then it pairs well with Joe's experience and background in large-scale urban design, architecture, and master planning. We're very passionate about active engagement and the testing of ideas as part of a planning process and bringing people together in a hands-on sort of way, and very focused on short-term implementation and what can be done quickly rather than just what can be done over the course of a 10 to 15-year period. And one of the themes of today's conversation is that small is big. When we were preparing for this, trying to consider the audience for today, we know that many of you are working on what some might call a small scale to revitalize a main street, but also trying to attract big companies as part of a larger economic development strategy to your region. And more, we really believe that those companies are they're following their employees or potential employees, and those people are choosing to live in places. They're choosing to live in places that are walkable, bikeable, historic, with cultural assets and recreational assets, which Virginia is rich in. And so as we think about small scale and incremental change in a Main Street type environment, that how that can start to translate to some of the bigger victories over time that enhance the tax base and bring more people to the region, we think that that connection is very important. And just want to rattle off a few kind of headlines here that we're going to touch on throughout our presentation. We really believe that implementation can start next weekend. And you're going to see in some of our slides how in our work we help our partners and clients get started that quickly and start bringing people together to affect positive change immediately. We are also big, and this is partially tied to my background in community development, but we're also very intentional about helping the communities we work with build out or update their operating system. Too often in the planning world, we make a lot of recommendations, but we don't think about who's going to wake up every day doing the work. And we intentionally use the word update because coming out of COVID-19 and with a lot of technological changes that have been happening over the recent years, that many operating systems are out of date and are focused on the wrong things. And then, of course, storytelling. We are big believers in storytelling and connecting story and audience and experience and brand to planning efforts and growth efforts. And we're also very intentional about making sure that that story isn't a new story for a place, but is representative of what it has been over time. And owning who you are and communicating that in a way that really, frankly, is the right thing to do because it respects the history of the place, but also is the best way to be competitive in this world of economic development. And we do that oftentimes through intentional activation. And we're going to walk you through at least one or two stories of how that has worked over time. So when we talk about our approach to planning, we usually show these two diagrams I'm about to show you. Traditionally, master planning or revitalization strategies start with a diagram like this, where we spend a lot of money and time and resources developing a plan. We ask people to come together and come to the library or come to the gymnasium and talk about strengths and weaknesses and think about 20 years out, put dots on maps. Many of us have done this. And then we adopt the plan, and what happens is a lot of times we say to the community, okay, you're done, we got your input, let us get to work. And too often what happens is a lot of time goes by after that, and the quote unquote experts get to work at building whatever it was that was recommended. But a couple of issues with this that we have. One is that oftentimes there's no market creation or market demand creation in the middle. And so on the picture on the right here, when something does get built, it is some compromise of what people said they wanted. They may have said, I want to save a historic building. And we value engineer that out of the process and have to tear it down. They might say they want retail on the ground floor, but the developer says that's not possible. And so in our work, we're not anti-planners. Obviously, we are planners. But we've inserted two things back into the process. We do think that planning can be smarter by focusing more intentionally on short-term outcomes, not just longer term. We think engagement can be smarter, but we also think that engagement isn't just a check-the-box moment in a planning process, that it's something that continues throughout the planning process and after. And so what can we, as you see on the slide here where it says build demand, what are the small things that we can pull out of a plan that we heard consistently and start testing the demand for? When this is done well, we've seen that it then creates opportunities for what we like to call smart small development. So we may have heard from the community that they really wanted a coffee shop, and we start testing that quickly and nimbly. And then that leads to the small investment in the small building that is often overlooked, housing that coffee shop. And then what happens from there is that walkable amenity starts to attract some of the bigger development that we all say we always want, and it starts to get and nestle in really closely to that smart small development that the community has helped create over time. And so by the time big things start happening in a neighborhood, the community feels like it wasn't done to them, but they were a part of it and participated and collaborated in the change. These were observations that Joe and I were having in our different careers back in 2015 and 2016. And we got together and we said, let's formalize this into a book. And we wrote, as Kyle said, something called the Neighborhood Playbook, which launched in 2016. The playbook is a field guide that you can, as you see, shove in your pocket. And you can walk around your neighborhood, and it helps you think about how to activate spaces in ways that create positive economic development outcomes for your neighborhood or your district or your city. And that book did pretty well after launching, and eventually led to Joe and I saying, you know what, this is being so widely supported that let's start a company and start testing some of these ideas with communities around the country. So I want to walk you through one of the first examples of that. And I'm starting with this question: is parking how you transform a district? Many people would say yes, and we agree, but in a different way. And let me tell you a story about that. So when we launched the Neighborhood Playbook, we said to some unsuspecting volunteers, hey, would you like to test this out in real time? And they said, sure. We have this is Bellevue, Kentucky. It's a town right across the river from downtown Cincinnati. They have a nice little historic Main Street, actually have a Main Street organization in their city. And they had this former historic bank building that you see in the picture on the edge of the district, in a kind of a sleepy, a downtrodden portion of the district. And they said, this building's for sale. It's been a social service agency for many years. We would like to see it become something more active, a restaurant, a bar, something that's active in the evening. The Main Street organization had done a survey prior to this and asked people what the Main Street was missing, and it was predominantly that we needed a restaurant that was open in the evening. And we said, okay, well, why don't you walk over to that building with the Neighborhood Playbook and start thinking about how you might activate that building. And right next to that building, as you see here, was a parking lot. And the realtor who was marketing the building was really emphasizing how valuable the parking was because it had off-street parking. And so we said, oh, well, this is kind of an interesting area. There's an alley in the back. It's right around the corner. It's kind of tucked away and hidden. What if we activated this space? It has this nice tree hanging over it. We could turn this into something. And those of you who know Cincinnati and know Northern Kentucky, oftentimes Northern Kentucky kind of apologizes for being Kentucky. We jokingly say that they like to think of themselves as Cincinnati light. And we said, you know what, let's put our flag in the ground and let's just embrace this idea of being Kentucky. And let's do what they called an old Kentucky makers market in this parking lot. Let's just do everything Kentucky forward. Let's have vendors that are selling handmade goods from Kentucky. Let's have Kentucky music. Let's have Kentucky food, Kentucky beer. And so these are some of the images of the build out of the first OKMM, which is what it became known as. And as you can see, we used the porch on the second story of the building for music. We found some old barrels and spray painted stencils on them. We found some pallets in the trash can. We grabbed some hay bales. We had very, very little to no budget for this. So as you can see in the middle picture, we used child labor. That's a joke, but I can never hear people laugh. It's virtual. No, we actually did use our kids to help set up. They really weren't that helpful. This became a pretty big event in Bellevue. The first one, I think this is an image from the first one, and the team started repeating these every month in the evening, once a month. Became not only revenue neutral, but actually revenue positive over time because we sold the beer. We charged vendor fees. And you know, we often refer to this type of work as a real-time market study. If you guys have ever done a market study, you know that they come and gather data and they tell you kind of some of the stuff you don't want to hear. Well, this was a real-time market study in the sense that we observed who the audience was coming to this, and it was mostly young families. In fact, on one of the events, we had a stroller parking problem. So on the second event, we created stroller valet to make sure that people could leave their stroller in a safe place. But joking aside, what this did was it uncovered this audience for an evening, family-friendly, entertainment-based event or program. And that started to inform how the building got marketed and who eventually became the tenant. And as you can see here, this is an aerial shot from above. And you can see people sort of brought their own chairs. We have 2x4s on buckets for seating and live music. And what happened was, over time, one of those vendors who was at that event actually said, you know what, we know someone who wants to could buy this building. We want to move in here and open a restaurant. And they opened something, and this is the ribbon cutting, called the Fairfield Market. And that, you know, it is not a coincidence that the old Kentucky Makers Market became the Fairfield Market. This became a bar, coffee shop, restaurant that also sold goods from local vendors. And over time, really became a successful place. And now the upstairs of this building is a 2-story event space. And guess what? Going back to the parking comment, it is no longer used exclusively for parking. The owner of the building has embraced it as outdoor seating and an outdoor patio for people to come and eat and drink, which, by the way, became extremely valuable during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is one, before I hand it off to Joe here, one pretty good example of how you might think about activation as a way to bring out a new audience, tell a story, in this case, owning the identity of Kentucky, which is a very valuable brand in Northern Kentucky because no one else has done it, get more people involved and engaged, and yield positive economic development outcomes that the community wanted. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Joe.
Great. Well, let me add my good morning, and we're excited to be here. Continuing with this theme of observations and insights, perhaps counterintuitive ones, for how to sustain or activate growth and market demand in our main streets and in our commercial districts. The next concept that we're going to put forth is all about finding starting points. And this kind of counterintuitive notion that where we begin isn't always the most visible or the most obvious location. You know, oftentimes if you read enough planning documents, particularly subsequent planning documents for the same neighborhood or the same main street, they all start to sound like they're making the same recommendation. And they all might say you need to focus on your main and main intersection, the kind of heart of the community. Well, the reality is, as much sense as that makes, that's also the location that has the most concern about it. And by concern, I mean where everybody's afraid of making the wrong decision, or where there's a lot of pent-up demand or felt demand for development there, which makes prices very out of touch with maybe the neighborhood context. And so what we often recommend is, while you're putting together the pieces for that main and main intersection, that maybe the best place to start turning the corner for your neighborhood is around the corner. This is a community in Cleveland called South Euclid, where their commercial main street had been overtaken by cars. They had seen a pretty sustained vacancy in their district, and they wanted us to help them put together a strategy for bringing back their community business district. And the first thing that we observed to them and recommended was that you've got an intersection of two county and state routes here. Not only do people who own the properties feel like they're sitting on a gold mine and therefore waiting for kind of an out-of-touch opportunity to land on the doorstep, but you've got a state and local DOT who thinks that this intersection is carrying a lot of water from a traffic standpoint. And we can't start to do things like calm the intersections or create mid-block connections or tame traffic volumes and speeds. And so that's the context that we inherited. And so we recommended that you have to start finding these side addresses, these nooks and crannies just off that main and main intersection that can start to be totally owned by the community operator, which is a community development corporation. It can be programmed, can be closed for that programming on a periodic basis. And because people aren't focused on, say, the alleys or the side streets, the real estate development potential, at least in the early years, is much more attainable. And the price is much more in line with where the market is in this community at this point in time than, say, the primary frontage or the primary intersection. So you can see how we start to think about recommendations around art, about community activity, about public space creation, all things that can be done on a provisional or a temporary basis that we can be doing with our left hand, while the right hand we're starting to acquire, assemble, stabilize the bigger development play that can come alongside it at a future date as market demand gets proven, understood, and then transitions into more sustained investment. This is, going back to that diagram, a good example of how we can be working in the short term to influence outcomes and shape development and get smart, small wins, and allowing bigger, more sophisticated development to be shaped by that, to be influenced by the brand, the character, the audience, and the market intelligence that's inherent to that type of process. So kind of building on that kind of philosophy, we spent a lot of time, as Kevin mentioned in our outset, of thinking about not only the North Star, where we want to be in 10, 15, 20 years, but how we can start moving on that today. Oftentimes in our industry, if you go back to that diagram again, we go away and we start thinking about that North Star vision and we start working towards the big catalytic change. But the reality is on the ground, if you're just a customer or a resident or somebody who may have participated in that planning exercise, no change is happening. All that hard work is being done behind closed doors with the hope that 5, 10 years from now, something big and transformative will happen. But what are some of the small things that we can do in the interim that are highly visible, highly impactful, start solving problems that people time and time again identify as critical to their neighborhoods, and starts to create that kind of public realm that is attractive and sticky to the private sector development. This is a project where we were asked to look at a network of streets where growth had started to happen actually, but the public realm was being left behind, leaving long-term residents and businesses dealing with the pressures of increased traffic, parking issues, speed and dangerous intersections. Also, while living on the kind of threshold to a major trail system in the area, and there was no ability to get out on 2 wheels or on a scooter and access that trail system. We're also dealing with streets that had not been transformed in any meaningful way amidst all this development. So we were asked to help transform for a 10-day trial period this network of streets using community volunteers. And so we worked with the community volunteers to understand the network and how it might be transformed, where there was excess capacity in the right-of-way, and then in 10 hours transformed the network of streets into bike lanes, safer intersections, new signage and wayfinding, infrastructure like bike racks, benches, things that bring people together while educating them on what this new type of infrastructure means. Most people that we worked with and observed using this system had never been exposed to something like a cycle track before. So what is that? How do you educate them about the benefits of such a facility type? And then people started, even in the course of a 10-day trial period, people started rebuilding their daily routine around accessing and using this network. This couple became regular users of the cycle track network as part of their morning routine. Before embarking on a bike ride, they would come down this path, have breakfast, pack up their bikes with a lunch to go, and then head out on the trail system. But we also wanted to engage a wider audience of what this network meant and what the priorities were as this transition from a trial project into a more permanent investment. And so putting opportunities around the network for kids, visitors, residents, all to come together and say what's working, what's not working, what surprised them, what they liked and didn't like about it. So as we transition then from getting started to how you start thinking about managing change and managing growth, you necessarily start thinking about regulation. And I would say that in no time in recent memory have we talked about regulation, particularly as the way development interfaces with the public realm, as we have in the past year with the onset of COVID-19, and how the public realm, namely our sidewalks and streets, can actually be a lifeline to businesses during a pandemic-like event. And on top of that, I think there's a greater understanding of the right type of regulation to solve the right kinds of problems that our communities are facing right now. Oftentimes we are rushing to adopt a form-based code or whatever the code type du jour is, without really understanding how to calibrate what is most acutely facing our business districts and main streets, and how we unleash powerful forces of change for good on that frontage along main streets. And so what we have been really focused on is 2 fronts on the zoning and regulation front. One is how we call it dezoning. What are things we can just go through with a red pen and take out of our zoning codes and ordinances that are actually working against what we need to do rather than for it. That's the first step. And then the second step, when we rebuild aspects of our ordinances, how do we focus on the things that impact us the most? We were able to boil down an entire Main Street code into one poster that you see on the screen here that dealt almost exclusively with the means by which we engage our buildings into the public realm. Porches, stoops, patios, storefronts, all those things, signage, all those things that really matter. That's what the building code and zoning officials would focus on going forward as a powerful supporting mechanism to see change happen along the Main Street. Then as we close out here, it's important to think about how the past year in particular has evolved what Kevin described as our operating systems for managing change, for one, but also growth and activity and development in a place. And so one of the things we're most excited about as a company is the growth of one of our divisions, EXP, which stands for experience. And think of this as a place management operation, operating in many ways like a bid would for a community. But we're focusing on things like placemaking, activation, programming, storytelling, and maintenance, safety, and cleanliness, all in one kind of interconnected service. And the idea is that it's not one size fits all, that every place has its own starting point, and because it has its own starting point, needs its own tailored and authentic operating system to help it accomplish its goals. So that, you know, programming, telling stories through a smart activation of a brand, signage, campaign, social media management, how we tell our stories and what the experience is in a place is more important than it ever has been. And then as that scales, creating really powerful ways to incubate growth. One of the things that is holding back many of our main streets, and as we think about a post-pandemic retail future, is this pipeline issue of not enough operators to fill the storefronts that we have. And when we do have the operators, they're outside our mission or outside our brand or character that we are trying to build there. And so increasingly we're being asked to develop these sub-districts. And this one's one in a neighborhood in Cincinnati where we create this active and programmed and well-managed public space for one, but really what it is a pipeline creator. It has 6 to 10 retail bays that can be rotated through on a monthly basis that quickly test different operators, see how their market responds to that location, and then links them to more permanent storefront spaces elsewhere in the neighborhood, all while creating opportunities for things that bring people together and differentiates this district from, say, competing districts. So cultural programming, the arts, different activities that are highly specific to this neighborhood. And that was somewhat influenced by this last story, which was totally driven out of the pandemic. In working with neighborhoods, this one in Baltimore, particularly neighborhoods that are Black and brown that had seen their libraries and community centers and schools shutter and do not have a functioning Main Street, how do we create this lifeline for businesses that may have been shuttered or may have only existed in somebody's living room, for kids that need opportunities for learning and activities to do, particularly in the summer, for life-saving health benefits and access, and even things like vaccines or food pantry drop-offs. How do we create these districts? And so we developed something called the neighborhood spots and have started to develop them in multiple locations. This one being in Virginia, in Norfolk, where we were tasked with finding 2 neighborhoods to locate these neighborhood spots in. We designed them en route to Norfolk. We posted up with our van and asked people what they thought about the designs. And then over the next 10 days, we got everybody together, hiring many folks from the neighborhood, not only to build the space, but to be permanent on-site management to make sure it was safe, clean, and active. And then our EXP platform managed these spaces for 8 months up until the culmination of the year to get these neighborhoods not only through the pandemic, but actually to exit the pandemic in a better state than they entered it. with new businesses being formed, new opportunities for public space, using this experience as a way of shaping future development and growth in these neighborhoods. And so one of the themes that you're hearing here is not just throwing events for events' sake, but using programming for a purpose. Activation as an agent, not only for fun, but for positive and sustained development in a place. And one of the things that is embodied in that is our latest real estate development, which is the garage in a main street that we're helping redevelop. We've actually started to purchase assets like this 100-year-old gas station, make it a venue for pop-up placemaking and intentional activation, but also creating a theory about change around the pandemic, where the ways that our social and home lives are starting to be intertwined with our work lives in new ways. So the best way to think about this garage is Airbnb for work and events, where I can get on my phone and book the space for a work meeting for an hour. Or I can host a corporate retreat here for the day, or be my own super host and have an amazing community event on site. And so with that, I really appreciate your time and attention, and welcome hopefully enough time for conversation.
Kevin and Joe, that was great. There's so much inspirational information there. One that's in a lot of very tangible ideas, plus a methodology that really mirrors or reflects or parallels what Main Street's all about. So everyone at this point, feel free to enter some questions into the chat. I have a few queued up that I was thinking about as we were moving through this, but would love for you all to feed some questions that really help to embrace these ideas and how you might implement some of them within your own spaces in districts and so forth. So have at it. And I hope to see some really good questions start to populate our chat. But Kevin and Joe, at this point, I do want to ask, as that starting point, what are those key ingredients to get some leaders, the community leaders, like the municipality and those community development organizations like Main Street, to buy into this smart small? Where do they really need to start with this?
Well, that's a good question. I think, speaking from experience, running a CDC here in Cincinnati, so I'll just fall back on that as an example. I think too often a mistake that is made by a group like that is to go lobby for funding to buy a building or revitalize a building without really a track record of showing momentum, right? And showing demand, showing that there's an energy to the place. And more than ever, it is easier to create that momentum through social media campaigns or online campaigns. And what we're saying is, by throwing intentional programming, testing, demand for retail or food or beverage in really interesting places with people in the neighborhood. And you mentioned neighborhood leaders. I would say that oftentimes the process that we have described on our slides is a way to almost acts as a leadership academy that recruits new leaders in who maybe don't want to go to the meeting and listen to someone else talk, or go to a meeting with Robert's Rules of Order. I'm speaking more so to the younger generation here that wants to be involved in other ways. They want to go clean up a street and do a cleanup event and then have some beers and listen to live music afterwards. But if done right, they'll stick around after they get involved through those means, and then become the president of the community council or of the Main Street organization. We've seen that time and time again. So I think we've shown you a lot of great imagery, I think, on these slides. And if you can get imagery like that of your own community, you can package that into a marketing document or a website that then makes it a lot easier to go down to the city to raise money to build out a building or to get the entitlements you need, the zone changes, whatever the barriers might be to creating that great place. And there are barriers, as Joe said when he was talking about regulation. Most regulation, even the new ones, the form-based codes of the world, really aren't that smart around the testing of ideas, the seating in the alley, the seating on the sidewalk, the parklet, on and on. So
I would just add on to that by saying that we're all trained to think comprehensively. That our default as people, I think, is to not start until we have every detail worked out. And then we feel confident enough to maybe get going. And the other thing is that comprehensive changes scares the living daylights out of most people. And so the way to circumvent both those phenomena is to find a way to start, and to do so in the context of where you generally want to go, but having enough humility to know that the line's not going to be a straight line. And then using a small intervention, however tiny as it may appear, as a way to just slowly build confidence in incremental change. And then that starts to become and morph into that leadership academy. It starts to influence decision making. It starts to create collateral assets that create the momentum and the marketing documents for larger and more complex stuff. So I think the starting small thing is actually a tool, is actually a benefit to some of the issues you talked about.
Yeah, and I'm hearing a bit of tactical urbanism in what you all are talking about, and I agree with you on some of these more long-term and larger investments. They're very, well, like you said, a bit difficult to embrace, or it would be a bit trepidatious about doing that. And so taking on these smaller projects it's much more tangible. It's much more easy to embrace because there may not be permanence. However, we know what happens when people experience things like Better Block. That's one of those first steps that happens for those more permanent types of infrastructure investments. And related to that, and I'm curious to hear what you think, this goes along with grassroots organizations, that volunteering is a lot different today than it used to be. People just don't have the time, and so we're seeing a lot more traction in getting work done and involvement, engagement from getting away from, say, committees so much as a bit more these task force and work groups that might be a bit more focused on specific small projects like what you're talking about. Have you witnessed this kind of shift, or what are your thoughts on that kind of direction or change with the way these organizations are getting work done and getting people involved?
Yeah, I think, maybe this is my former nonprofit hat coming back on, but I love a good committee structure.
Yeah.
For organizational purposes that, reports back to the board of directors, and then it's a way to hold each other accountable. But I think I agree with you, which is that I think more and more people want to be, if they're going to be on a committee, they don't just want to show up once a month and listen to a report out by staff.
Yeah.
I think there is more of a let's get to work kind of mentality. So if you're on a beautification committee or task force, whatever you might want to call it, you'd rather be getting your hands dirty, planting the flower pots or painting a mural than, listening to someone else talk about what they did, and on and on. So,
yeah,
in the Main Street world, we've seen more and more just that the placemakers are the retailers too. Yeah. That more and more with retail districts, retailers have to be placemakers more than ever because of COVID, because of the technology that has emerged, where if you're not, creating an experience as part of your clothing shop or your bar, your restaurant, you're failing. So, that type of group is certainly more hands-on, and we've seen that in Main Street organizations across the country, where it's less about the board meeting and it's more about how we can get to work.
And Kyle, what you're describing also has implications for how we think about public engagement, either inside or outside of a formal planning process. We're big believers that the COVID was the final death knell, hopefully, for the centralized meeting outside the neighborhood at our time, at our place, with our agenda. And that because of what you described, people don't have time and it's hard to get to these places. We have to find new ways of engaging our stakeholders in our communities. And everything that we talked about today, that we're discussing today, is part of the formula for doing so.
Yeah. And I'm hearing some parallel to, say, strategic doing principles, which really is more about getting that traction and momentum and seeing those incremental changes. And then each month, you're thinking about, okay, what can we complete in the next 30 days before we meet? And so that keeps that moving and those small projects going. So I'm so glad that we're talking about this. But I do have a question from one of our participants in Colonial Beach. So that's on the eastern coast of Virginia. And Joyce asks, how do we target and attract retail that will complement existing businesses, the brand we are trying to build, and certain economic objectives, while not being viewed as antagonistic to new businesses that may not align with those objectives?
Well, it's interesting. We were just on a phone call yesterday with sounds like a similar town in North Carolina, on the beach. And I don't know if this is where he or she was going with that question, but it's this challenge of how do you build businesses that are there for the year-long residents and the year-long businesses, while not being antagonistic to tourists or the changing tides. Changing tides, pun intended. It's a relevant question for every community. How do you grow and attract new people and new businesses without threatening or displacing the historic residents, culture, and businesses? Much of that we really believe is in the storytelling and the branding, which, as you saw from our slides, really trickles down into everything we do. It trickles down into how we engage communities. It trickles into how we brand the master plan, how we make recommendations around events and activation, how you talk about yourself on social media. And not only is it the right thing to do to try to gear that brand towards the existing or historic culture of the place, it also, if you run away from what you are, it's just short-term thinking. But if you embrace who you are, your unique self, then you'll be more competitive. And then the people who like that about you will choose to open a business in your neighborhood or move to your neighborhood or your city. They'll choose it for the right reasons, if you will. I mean, and we've seen that in largely African-American neighborhoods that are gentrifying or risk of gentrification, that if you start talking about yourself not as something that is changing into something else, but as something that is, you're a Black neighborhood, you have culture, you have history around that then you'll start to see more people move in because they want to be a part of a diverse neighborhood. You'll see more minority-owned businesses choose to locate in that neighborhood. So I think a big part of it is having a really smart storytelling and communication strategy, really knowing who you are, and then that influencing pretty much all aspects of community revitalization.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is, it really is about projecting an image, really making sure that folks know that we're inclusive, we're welcoming, and then, letting the rubber hit the road, really showing that through those engagement opportunities and listening on a regular basis. It's not just a big visioning once every 5 years or once a year. It really is a constant activity. So that's wonderful. I have a question around once a community is effectively activated or a space or helped small volunteer-based grassroots groups get creative, how do they translate / communicate that message or idea to decision makers to create change? Well,
one example we've said this before in other presentations, and the example in Bellevue, Kentucky that I talked about is a good example of this working. We've seen a lot of times when we started to measure our own community engagement or activation outcomes this way, how many people who are involved in that end up becoming the elected official or becoming the president of the board of directors. In the case of the Old Kentucky Makers Market, I think 3 or so, well, 3's a lot. I mean, 3 people ended up running for city council and are now on city council. So they are those leaders. And part of that came out of the fact when they were trying to do the Old Kentucky Makers Market, they were running into barriers at the city. They were seeing that this wasn't something that was easy, and that they wanted a city that was more in the identity of what they were creating. So that's, that's one answer to that question.
Well, I think just to tack onto that, I think it goes back to this notion that seeing is believing. That if you're working with an administration that has only done one thing one way for a long time, maybe even before they were in place, there's oftentimes no impetus to make change. Change rocks the boat. Change alienates people. Change, does this, that, or the other thing. But if we can get people around something that's working and talk about it, another example that comes up often in the pandemic is parklets and curb extensions and hacking our outdoor space for businesses to continue with their operations. That was a fearful thing prior to the pandemic. But I can name a number of instances where leadership culture has changed as a result of just seeing how it works in a kind of semi-safe setting. And so I do believe in the powerful nature of these small trials, not only to figure out the design implications of what we're doing, but the kind of leadership and decision-making implications of what's possible.
Yeah. I think this ties into what you said earlier, and Kevin, I believe you have some experience from past careers related to this. But can you talk about your approach to inclusive community engagement and possibly gentrification? I think they might be a little different, but certainly connected.
Sure. We've touched a little bit on inclusive community engagement. I mean, our general philosophy there is, as Joe mentioned, I think earlier, we can no longer expect people to come to our meeting at our time, in our location, with our agenda, and expect inclusive outcomes. Especially in communities that are low income, where folks have a lot going on in their lives, including keeping a roof over their heads or feeding their children. They're not going to come to the meeting. And then, so we can't check that box and then go off and make a bunch of important decisions and expect gentrification to not occur, or to call it an inclusive process. So I think just the way we do engagement needs to be more active. We meet people where they are, at the bus stop, at the grocery store. We take 2 minutes of their time to fill out a survey. Oftentimes we don't even do a survey because the survey is an agenda in some ways written by us. So more so, sometimes it's just conversational. It's like, hey, what are you worried about? What do you like about your neighborhood? And then that might inform a survey down the road. So there's that. We've even got to the point now where when we go into neighborhoods that don't look like us, or or we're not from there, we're not local to the place, of paying members of the community to engage the community with us. So creating paid community ambassador programs, so that we ensure we can actually reach the hard to reach populations that wouldn't talk to us. Mm-hmm. And in terms of on the ground management of change, and as it relates to gentrification, obviously inclusive practices like the ones we just listed off are important, but I would also say that you should just never stop listening, and don't run away from the hard conversations. So if racial equity or racism or systemic racism is part of the dialogue in the community, then hold listening sessions about that on a regular basis. Yeah. And that's a really easy first step. It might be kind of intimidating at first, and you might get a lot of frustration sent your way. But you'll get, over the long haul, gain a lot of respect for holding those sessions. And then, of course, you'll have to hold yourself accountable for what you hear, kind of taking that and actually having that influence how you operate.
Yeah.
So those are some initial thoughts there.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, those kinds of conversations are difficult, and the best leaders lean into them, and you ask questions, and you approach it with curiosity. There are some resources to help out with that kind of thing. The Community Heart and Soul, that is completely a grassroots designed community listening and planning program. It's a long one, but there's some amazing tools that are in there to learn how to listen. You know, we're really good at delivering information, but it's really hard for all of us to craft, you know, really powerful questions that pull out the information that's necessary to make really good decisions for the community. So think about some of those tools. They're out there, and learn about asking those good questions and the kinds of environments that you need to create. You guys are absolutely right about going to them. It makes me think of some of the strategic plannings that I've witnessed, where yes, they might have gotten a really good turnout, but those are the mobile people. You know, there might be some folks at home that can't leave, or you know, may just be more comfortable staying within their neighborhood, and so you do have to go to them. So with Main Street, it's not so much about just asking the stakeholders that are within your district boundaries. It really is thinking about all of that market and those people who will be using the downtown, and making sure that one, it's representative of the population and diversity of your community, but then going into those neighborhoods for those Q&As in a sort of tent raising kind of experience. So thank you for addressing that. I think that's a really powerful message there. Man, it's already noon. We do have till 12:15, but I wanted to ask one more question, unless there's another one from the audience here. But you all mentioned real-time market study, and I love that. And that is from that experience of you know, taking on tactical urbanism, or you know, creating those small changes that are temporary. But do you have any guidance about how and what to collect around those kinds of things? And what I'm getting at are metrics. Are there any sort of important metrics that need to be grasped in order to communicate to the leadership, to the people, the change makers, you know, that this was effective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and the fourth play of the playbook actually is all about that question. And how you harvest information from the work that you're doing. And we use that information for two primary purposes. One is to address what you've described, which is how does it influence decision making and where we go from here, and to make a case, often a business case, for continuing or growing a program. But it's also a design intelligence gathering opportunity, where the old Kentucky Makers Market, for instance, it probably reconfigured itself 4 or 5 times before it started really humming. And because we weren't, you know, drilling or planting foundations or even plants at the outset, we were able to be nimble and learn from things that were misconstrued or things didn't turn out the way we thought they would.
Yeah.
So it's a powerful design tool to evolve the final product, if there is such a thing. You know, the best places are always kind of kinetic. They're changing and adapting and learning from that data that's harvested. So the playbook talks about the different metrics that you collect to influence the design. But then, as you mentioned, it also can inform the story that's forming here, and how it can impact or shape what happens in the neighborhood or in the district.
Yeah.
So we talk about things that are probably most easily to grasp, like around spending and vendor retention and coming back and those kind of things that are pretty easy in the grand scheme of things, or people even showing up. But then there's other things that are kind of exist right beneath the surface that really kind of take a fine eye to observe. Just picking on the old Kentucky Makers Market again, the example we love to tell is we had a stroller parking problem. And if you had done a market study for a retail market study for that business district, it would have used and relied upon very coarse data. And it would have not given you the sense that there are young families with wallets that want an experience like the one that was prepared in Kentucky Makers Market. And then that starts to shape not only this retail opportunity, which it did and continues to do, but the next 3 or 4 things that came out of the ground up and down the street. And so documenting that through numbers, through photos, through testimonials, that creates a powerful study that that can exist alongside a more traditional market study that still performs a function when it comes time to getting financing, for instance, or getting a business plan approved. Some of that stuff is unavoidable for the time being. So it just is powerful supplement to the more traditional metrics.
Great, and we all like our toolkit. So I'm very curious to see the playbook and implement some of those ideas. And I have one last question, and I think we've got to close out. Tell me your thoughts on activation of a district throughout the year versus, say, one big festival that happens and moves on, which we know takes a lot of human and financial capital to pull one of those things off. So what are your thoughts about creating distance throughout the year? Period. Question mark.
Yeah, I think activation can be defined in multiple ways. So I would say you shouldn't just be thinking about it throughout the year. You should be thinking about it every week. And everything from starting small with what is the mechanisms for safe and clean? What are the mechanisms for storytelling and social media and newsletters and website? And by that category, what I mean is day to day, how are you telling a story about the district? Are you promoting a sale at a quilt store? Are you promoting a happy hour? Is a certain business having a guy with a guitar playing on the patio? So telling that story every day is key. And then what's happening on the weekends? That's probably more individual businesses holding sales, holding events. And then, is there a monthly event, like a First Friday type event that a community is holding? And then to your point, what is the sort of quarterly event? What is the big art festival in May versus the fall festival in the fall, or the winter festival in the winter? So I think you have to think about it from top to bottom. And how are you activating it daily? And to me, activation could mean picking up trash and removing graffiti and putting out a sidewalk sign, all the way up to the 2,000 person event that is a regional attraction because of it's this pumpkin festival or something in the fall.
Yeah. I agree with you on that. Yeah, go on. Pardon me.
You certainly can't activate it just once or twice a year. You can't. That won't work.
Yeah. And, just creating those third places, comfortable places where people can hang out so that, they can sit outside and treat it as a bit of a co-working space. If there's Wi-Fi, sitting outside, or just sitting outside and having a cup of coffee, having buskers, those are real, fairly simple ways to create, attract people downtown, but then also having those activities. Roger Brooks has some really good resources about creating that sense of activity 365 days of the year. And so there's another resource for you. And also, back to the questions real quick, World Cafe is a great model for community engagement and creating environments for dialogue and asking really good, powerful questions. So that's another one to think about. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking time out of your day in Cincinnati to talk to Virginia. Everyone, I hope that you enjoyed that. The information, I think, is incredibly powerful. I'm just going to end here with a couple of slides. Let's see, where am I? There we go. So thank you, Kevin and Joe, for getting us all thinking about creating extraordinary places. In addition, thanks to everyone for taking time out of your day to participate. I hope Kevin and Joe spark some ideas to expand authenticity and vitality to lives in your local neighborhood commercial districts. You can find information about the Creating Community Vitality series on virginiamainstreet.com, where you can also learn about downtown management best practices, local stories, funding opportunities, and upcoming events across the Commonwealth. Sign up to receive posts in the bottom right-hand corner of the landing page. Upcoming on May 17th is a podcast with Aaron Bolzwell of Tulsa Remote, a unique talent recruitment initiative of the Kaiser Family Foundation. And you'll find a link to that on virginiamainstreet.com. In June, we will focus on housing with the founders of the Power of Cute podcast and senior faculty of the Incremental Development Alliance. The session will be a broad brush on the principles of small-scale incremental development, and we'll dive into a few case studies for more detail. There seems to be a pattern here if you all aren't catching that, huh? So also, we're here to help. If you have any questions, please reach out to DHCD's Community Revitalization Office staff. Contact information and tons of community building resources are available on the DHCD website and Virginia Main Street blog. Hyperlinks are active in the webinar handout. So thanks again, everyone. Kevin and Joe, thanks so much. This was such a rich conversation. You're doing incredible work. Hope that we run across you again in the future.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Everyone be well.